So tell us about the study, just the broad strokes of or you can get into the narrow strokes of the study that the book was based on.
Yeah, I was talking to 122 people. We recruited them in state prison in Massachusetts about a week before they were released, and we interviewed them in prison. And then we talked to people again 2 weeks later. So now they're out in the community. They've been released from prison, and we followed them over a year. And we were talking to them a lot about their housing, their family relationships, their employment, their health. And we're trying to understand how people make the transition from incarceration back into communities.
And these 122 people, I mean, how did you decide which ones to interview, or was it just simply as they were coming up for release?
Yeah, it was basically that. The only criteria for eligibility for the study was that you were returning to a neighborhood in the Boston area. And although the study was, spanned the greater Boston area, we're in the field for 3 years talking to people, and we were basically in 5 or 6 neighborhoods, mostly very disadvantaged communities of color.
Okay, and so when you started the Boston reentry study, what were you specifically looking to find in terms of how people adjusted, or how people got into prison, or both?
I guess I was focused on the issue of adjustment, and there had been a lot of research, and I had done a bunch of research on how serving time in prison affects people after they're released. And in the work that I'd done earlier, I was really focused on employment, how people with prison records find work, and how their families are doing. And I was studying these big data sets drawn on national samples, and I wasn't convinced I was really understanding the texture of people's lives, what it's like to go through. You've been institutionalized for 3, 4, 5 years, and you have to find your place in your community again. I wasn't convinced that I really understood that process well, even though I'd been studying it quantitatively with these big social surveys for many years.
And to what extent? And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but to what extent does inputs affect the outputs? In other words, how the prisoners were situated beforehand implicate how they are as they are released.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it has a big effect. And I think we learned a lot in this respect in the research. And there were two things that were really striking for us. And one is that the people that we were interviewing had been exposed to a lot of trauma and a lot of violence in their lives. It often dated from very early in childhood, and this was related to their health as adults, and a lot of the people we were interviewing were not in very good health. High rates of depression, high rates of PTSD. In many cases, they're in poor physical health. They suffered with chronic pain, persistent drug addiction over their lives. And these kinds of things, exposure to trauma in childhood, poor health in adulthood, this made the whole process of the reentry back into the community very challenging. And we saw a lot of very deep poverty, a lot of housing insecurity after people got out of prison.
Talk a little bit more about the nature of that trauma. I mean, you sat down with 122 folks, and one of the statistics that I think jumps out at you and certainly at me was the number of those people who had witnessed a death
Yeah,
of a
yeah.
person.
Yeah, this was shocking, and going into the project, I was not really attuned to this issue. I was sort of coming at it as a criminal justice person, as a poverty researcher. But as we got to know people, and we got to know a lot of the people in the sample really well, they began to open up to us about their lives, and we were hearing a lot about the different kinds of violence that they'd been exposed to, and a lot of chaotic home life, and about halfway through our field period, we're sort of into our 6-month interviews, and we're thinking, man, we got to ask about childhood, and we have to ask about exposure to trauma in childhood. So we developed a whole module in our survey that really tried to take a deep dive into this, and we asked people, did you grow up with someone who struggled with addiction? Did you grow up with family violence in the home? Had you witnessed someone being killed? 40% of our sample said they'd witnessed someone being killed. And we could only really get to these questions after we'd gotten to know people for about a year and really developed some rapport and trust with them. And for me, this whole area raises ethical questions as much as it does policy questions and social science questions about the process of reentry, because I think we divide the world in criminal justice talk often into these two separate spheres. There are victims and there are offenders, and the job of the criminal justice system is to punish offenders, but the people we were talking to had often very long and serious histories of victimization. And this makes the whole ethical equation much more complicated for me. And I think it should open the door to sentiments like mercy and leniency and compassion.
Well, let's get to the policy implications of that in a moment. But so let's turn to the idea of reentry. What
Yes.
are and presumably the idea is that like prison theoretically, or the way that we are sold the idea of the carceral state is it seems to be a two-part. Right? One is to ostensibly to protect society from these folks who are put into prison, and the other is to rehabilitate, right? And to or I guess to punish and then to hope to rehabilitate. I mean, what is like what are the premises in which you measure success for prison as a researcher?
Yeah. So I think the overwhelming attention has been focused on the problem of recidivism. Do people engage in crime again after they come out of prison? Do they get arrested? Do they return to incarceration? And so that, I think, is where a lot of the research is. In my thinking, that's not quite the right focus, because a lot of recidivism lies beyond the control of the individual who's been incarcerated. The biggest predictor of return to incarceration in our data was relapse to addiction, and people were either engaging in new crimes to support their drug habits, so they were selling drugs or committing robberies to support their addictions, or they were failing drug tests. They were on probation or parole and they were being drug tested, and they failed a drug test. So, for people who study drug addiction, relapse is part of the process by which people can ultimately and sustainably become sober again. And there's very little scope in the criminal justice system to allow people the process of their recovery and allow for the possibility of relapse. And you think about probation and parole, which are meant to assist people in the community get back on their feet after incarceration and continue the process of rehabilitation. Probation and parole in practice are really surveillance authorities. Probation and parole officers aren't given the resources or the training to really help people with what they need, which is help managing their health, their addictions, help finding housing, and help finding employment. And so I think what we should be focused on, rather than recidivism, is social integration. How do people find their place in their communities and families again after they've been separated through this forced institutionalization of incarceration? And if we can do that, if we can promote social integration, then I think people will tend to desist from crime and become functioning members of their communities.
So, I mean, to have the positive agenda of how do we reintegrate people into the community will impact the negative agenda of preventing people from going back into prison. But is there also, I mean, and again, maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself here before we talk a little bit more about the data that you found, but is it part of the problem that as a society, we don't really, it's unclear to me that we subscribe to, that the problem of recidivism is not necessarily, or the problem for that matter, to put in a more positive way, the problem of how do we reintegrate a former prisoner into society are really not. It's really not the way that most, at least Americans, I think, perceive prison, right? That it's more of like, we got to keep people safe, or it should be about punishment. And that the problem that you're talking about is the failure of succeeding at reintegrating people into the community is simply because there's no political will to do so.
Yeah, I think all of that is true, and I think we need to develop a different culture, a different language, a more realistic language of the kinds of social conditions that people are struggling with on the ground. Because the perspective, the dominant perspective, which you just described, makes a whole variety of assumptions about what the reality on the ground looks like. Crime is a decision made by people who are making bad moral choices. Victims and offenders are two different groups of people, and guilty offenders prey on innocent victims. And the kinds of things we were finding when we talked to people and got to know them and talked to their families, victims and offenders are not two different groups of people. People who have committed serious violence, and we shouldn't minimize that, often have very serious histories of victimization themselves. They often grew up in our poorest neighborhoods, our most segregated neighborhoods. Their opportunities were extremely poor from a very early age. And for me, this is a social world that is just shot through with ethical ambiguity, and we got to come to grips with that reality. And I think, American culture and politics can be very judgmental and moralistic, and doesn't really grapple with the harshness of the conditions of American poverty, which are unusually challenging for really low-income people, and particularly in communities of color, I think.